At 60 years old, after 35 years of marriage, 2 grown children, and a fully paid-off mortgage, my husband and I sat at our polished dining table on a quiet Tuesday evening and signed our divorce papers without a single tear, raised voice, or harsh word. 2 weeks later, standing in our front hallway looking at 2 neatly packed leather suitcases by the door, I realized that the most dangerous thing that can happen to a marriage isn't fighting. It is 30 years of polite silence. Paul was 62. He had just retired as an architectural civil drafter. He was wearing his usual gray cardigan, his silver hair neatly combed, holding a cardboard box filled with his drafting compasses, old blueprints, and 2 framed prints of bridges we had visited in Europe 20 years ago. Outside our suburban home in Raleigh, the moving van's engine hummed softly in the driveway. "Did you take the spare keys to the shed, Paul?" I asked, my voice as calm and practical as if we were coordinating grocery pickup. "Yes, they're in my pocket," Paul replied, offering a faint, courteous nod. "And the title for the station wagon is on the kitchen counter beside the insurance forms. I made sure it's in your name." "Thank you," I said. He set his box down on the hall bench, stepped toward me, and wrapped his arms around my shoulders. It was a gentle, familiar embrace. It held warmth, gratitude, and a profound, quiet sorrow. But there was no passion, no desperate clinging, and no regret. "Take good care of yourself, Diane," he whispered against my hair. "You too, Paul," I replied. He picked up his box, lifted his suitcase, and walked out the front door. I watched through the sidelight window as he climbed into his car and pulled away down the tree-lined street. The front door was closed. The house was completely still. I stood alone in the entryway of a 4-bedroom colonial house that had held 35 years of our shared history. For 32 years, I had worked as a high school guidance counselor. Every week, students and parents sat in my office pouring out their hearts about volatile arguments, explosive breakups, infidelity, and betrayal. I had spent my entire professional life mediating chaos. Yet my own marriage had ended without a single explosion. It had died of natural causes, smothered beneath 3 decades of domestic duty, polite compromises, and the slow, invisible evaporation of romantic love. To understand how 2 decent, kind people end up divorcing in silence at 60, you have to look at the powerful illusion of the good marriage. Paul and I married in 1991 when I was 25 and he was 27. We were young, sensible, and deeply committed to building an honorable life. Paul was a steady, dependable man who never raised his hand, never gambled, never drank to excess, and never forgot an anniversary. I was an organized, devoted wife who cooked balanced meals, managed the family budget, and attended every single school concert, parent-teacher conference, and Little League game. To our neighbors, our church community, and our extended families, the Palmers were the gold standard of suburban stability. We never engaged in screaming matches on the front lawn. We never slammed doors. When disagreements arose over money, home renovations, or family vacations, we spoke in calm, measured tones and reached sensible, logical compromises. We told ourselves that this was maturity. We told ourselves that this was what enduring love looked like. What we failed to see was that compromise, when repeated without passion or emotional risk, can slowly become a substitute for genuine connection. In our 30s and 40s, the sheer velocity of family life masked the growing emotional distance between us. Raising our daughter Sarah and our son Luke was an all-consuming enterprise. Our days were structured around school buses, dental appointments, mortgage payments, soccer tournaments, and college savings funds. Paul and I became exceptional business partners in the joint venture of parenthood. Every evening was a master class in domestic logistics. "Did you pick up Sarah from track practice?" I would ask, while chopping vegetables. "Yes, and I filled the tank on the sedan," Paul would answer, unloading his briefcase. "Luke has a history project due on Thursday. I'll help him with the poster board after dinner. Wonderful. I'll finish the laundry and review the electric bill. We operated like two skilled co-managers running a small, highly efficient corporation. Somewhere along the way, we stopped looking at each other as romantic partners. The spontaneous kisses in the kitchen became quick pecks on the cheek as we rushed out the door. The deep, late-night conversations about our private dreams and existential fears turned into hurried discussions about property tax assessments and furnace maintenance. We stopped sharing our inner lives because there simply wasn't time, and eventually because we had forgotten how. When physical intimacy faded to once every few months, and then once a year, and then ceased altogether in our early 50s, neither of us raised an alarm. We convinced ourselves that this was the natural, honorable trajectory of aging. Society tells us that romance belongs to the young, and that older couples must settle for comfortable companionship. We told ourselves that being good roommates was more than enough. The first major crack in our carefully constructed illusion appeared 4 years ago at our daughter Sarah's wedding. It was a glorious autumn afternoon at a vineyard in the Virginia countryside. Sarah looked radiant in her lace gown, marrying a wonderful young pediatrician she adored. During the reception, the band played an old jazz ballad, and the master of ceremonies invited all married couples to join the newlyweds on the dance floor. Paul took my hand, led me out under the fairy lights, and placed his hand gently on the small of my back. Around us, our friends cheered and raised their champagne glasses, celebrating the Palmers' 30-plus years of unbroken devotion. I looked up into Paul's gray-blue eyes. His face was kind, handsome, and familiar down to the smallest wrinkle around his temples. But as we swayed to the music, I felt a terrifying, icy realization wash over me. I do not know this man at all. And worse, he does not know me. We were two strangers wearing formal attire, performing the dance of a happy couple for an audience of 80 people. There was no resentment between us, no bitterness, and no hidden malice. There was simply nothing there. Our marriage was an empty frame holding the faded photograph of a partnership whose purpose had already been fulfilled. When the wedding ended and we returned home, life moved rapidly toward the inevitable final stage. 2 years later, our son Luke graduated from college, landed a software design job in Charlotte, and bought his first townhouse. The Saturday morning Luke packed his final moving boxes into his pickup truck was crisp and clear. We hugged him on the front porch, gave him our blessings, and watched him drive away. Paul and I walked back inside and closed the front door. For the first time in 32 years, there were no children in the house. There were no sports bags in the hallway. There were no school schedules on the refrigerator. There was no homework to supervise. The 4-bedroom house was entirely, completely silent. We walked into the kitchen. Paul leaned against the counter, crossed his arms, and looked around the spotless room. "Well," he said softly, his voice echoing against the tile backsplash. "We did it, Diane. They're both grown and on their own." "Yes," I said, "we did." We stood there for 2 full minutes in absolute silence. There was nothing left to coordinate. There was no schedule to manage. There were no crises to solve. In that silence, the profound emptiness of our union was stripped bare. Over the next 6 months, the house became a monastery of polite isolation. Paul spent 8 hours a day in the basement, meticulously restoring vintage furniture and listening to talk radio through headphones. I spent my days in the upstairs den, reading historical biographies, tending my garden, and volunteering at the local library. We met at the dining table at 6:30 p.m. every evening for dinner. The dinners were agony. We chewed our food in rhythm with the ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. "Good chicken, Diane," Paul would say. "Thank you, Paul. The weather is supposed to turn cold on Thursday. I'll check the chimney damper tomorrow. Thank you." That was the entirety of our daily communication. We were not living together. We were merely occupying parallel coordinates in space. We were waiting for the clock to run out on our lives, trapped by our own terror of admitting that our marriage had died 20 years earlier. The crisis came on an ordinary Tuesday evening in November. I was sitting in the living room reading when I looked over at Paul, who was sitting in his armchair doing a crossword puzzle. The lamplight caught the silver in his hair, the slump in his shoulders, and the quiet resignation in his posture. A sudden sharp wave of sorrow and clarity hit my chest. We have maybe 20 good years left on this earth, I thought. Are we going to spend 7,000 more evenings pretending to do crossword puzzles and discussing chimney dampers? I set my book down on the side table. Paul, I said, my voice quiet but steady. Can we put the puzzle down for a moment? Paul looked up, slightly surprised, and set his pen on the armrest. Sure, Diane, what is it? I took a deep breath, feeling my heart pound against my ribs. Paul, are you happy? I asked. He stared at me for several seconds, his eyes searching my face for context. He tried to summon his customary polite response. Diane, we have a good life, he began cautiously. We have healthy kids, a paid-off house, good retirement accounts. I didn't ask about our assets or our children, Paul, I interrupted gently. I asked about you. Are you happy in this marriage? Paul stopped. The words hung in the air between us like smoke in a closed room. He looked down at his hands, his fingers curling slowly into loose fists. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. When he finally looked up, his eyes were moist, and the careful mask he had worn for 30 years cracked completely. No, Diane, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm not. I haven't been happy for a very long time. Are you? No, I answered, a single tear slipping down my cheek. I'm not either. Saying those words out loud did not bring panic. It brought a wave of profound, instantaneous relief, so overwhelming that I could finally breathe. We sat in the living room and talked until 3 a.m. For the first time in 3 decades, we spoke with absolute, unvarnished honesty. We didn't point fingers. We didn't bring up old grievances. We didn't blame each other for failing. We simply acknowledged the truth. We were two fundamentally different people who had come together to raise a family, had executed that duty with honor and excellence, but had nothing left to offer each other as romantic partners. What do we do now? Paul asked, his voice weary. People our age don't get divorced without a scandal, Diane. What will our families say? What will Sarah and Luke think? They will think we are being honest, Paul, I said firmly. We gave them 30 years of our youth and our devotion. We don't owe them the sacrifice of our remaining years just to maintain an illusion. Telling our adult children was the hardest hurdle we had ever faced. We invited Sarah and Luke to the house for Sunday brunch 3 weeks later. When we sat them down in the living room and told them we had decided to separate and file for an uncontested divorce, Sarah broke down in tears. Mom, Dad, this makes no sense. Sarah sobbed, looking back and forth between us. You guys never fight. You've been married 35 years. People don't just throw away a marriage at 60. Luke, however, sat quietly on the sofa, studying both of our faces. Sarah, stop, Luke said quietly, putting a hand on his sister's shoulder. He looked at Paul and then at me. I've watched Mom and Dad for the last 10 years, Luke said softly. They haven't laughed together since I was in middle school. They look exhausted every time we come over. If they want to be happy for the rest of their lives, we should be cheering for them, not making them feel guilty. Paul and I looked at our son, our eyes filling with tears of gratitude. In that moment, I realized that our children didn't need us to be martyrs. They needed us to be whole, authentic human beings. Our divorce was finalized 6 months later. There were no contentious courtroom battles, no forensic accountants, and no bitter negotiations. We used a single collaborative mediator to divide our retirement pensions 50-50 and sold the large family home. Paul used his share of the equity to buy a charming small cottage near the coast in Wilmington, where he set up an art studio to pursue landscape painting, a passion he had abandoned in his 20s to support our family. I purchased a bright, sun-drenched two-bedroom condominium in downtown Raleigh, walking distance from art galleries, museums, botanical parks, and independent coffee shops. The first 6 months living alone were an emotional roller coaster. There were moments of intense, disorienting grief. When you dismantle 35 years of shared habits, you have to learn how to exist as an individual all over again. I had to learn how to cook for one person without making enough for an army. I had to learn how to manage home repairs, hang artwork, and balance my checkbook without consulting another adult. There were evenings when the silence in my new apartment felt vast and intimidating. But as the weeks passed, that vast silence transformed into something extraordinary. Freedom. I didn't have to tiptoe around someone else's mood. I didn't have to eat dinner at 6:30 sharp. If I wanted to eat yogurt and berries for dinner while reading poetry at 9 p.m., I could. If I wanted to leave a canvas and watercolor paint spread across the dining table for 3 weeks, no one asked me to pack them away. I enrolled in watercolor painting classes at the local university. I joined a weekly hiking club that explored the Carolina trails. I reconnected with female friends I had neglected during the frantic years of motherhood. My home became filled with vibrant colors, fresh flowers, laughter, and an energy that had been absent from my life for 3 decades. A year after our divorce was finalized, our granddaughter Maya had her 3rd birthday party in Charlotte. When I arrived at Sarah's house, Paul was already there in the backyard, helping Luke set up the birthday tent. He was wearing a linen shirt, looking tanned, relaxed, and years younger than the tired man who used to stare at crossword puzzles in our living room. When he saw me walk through the gate, he smiled with genuine, unforced warmth. "Hello, Diane," he called out, walking over to give me a warm, comfortable hug. "You look wonderful. Sarah showed me pictures of your garden from last week. Those hydrangeas are incredible." "Thank you, Paul," I laughed. "And I saw the watercolor landscape you sent Luke. Your brushwork is magnificent." We spent the afternoon eating cake, laughing with our children and taking turns pushing Maya on the swing set. There was no awkward tension. There was no resentment.
We were 2 old friends who had survived the storm of life together, who respected each other's past, and who genuinely wished each other peace in the future.
Sarah walked over to me as the party was winding down, watching Paul teach Maya how to blow soap bubbles. "Mom," Sarah said quietly, leaning against my shoulder, "I owe you an apology. When you first told us, I thought you were ruining our family. But seeing you and Dad today, you're both so much lighter. You're actually happy." "We are, darling," I whispered. "We really are. I am 66 years old now." Looking back on my 35 years of marriage and 6 years of independence, I understand now what society gets profoundly wrong about relationships and aging. We are taught from childhood that the only successful marriage is one that ends in a funeral. We are told that endurance is the highest virtue, and that as long as there is no violence or betrayal, leaving a marriage is an act of failure and weakness. That is a dangerous, soul-crushing lie. Endurance is not love. The mere absence of shouting does not mean a relationship is alive. It takes immense courage to build a marriage and raise children. But sometimes it takes even greater courage to look at the person you have shared your life with and say, "We have completed our journey together with honor. Now, let us give each other permission to live our remaining years in truth." A good divorce that honors decades of history is infinitely more honorable than a living funeral disguised as a marriage. Never stay in a lifeless routine simply because you are afraid of the quiet. The quiet of being alone with your own dignity is 1,000 times sweeter than the suffocating silence of a dead partnership. Most evenings now, as the Carolina sun sets, casting long golden shadows across my living room, I sit by my window with a cup of chamomile tea and my sketchbook. The room is quiet, The streets below are peaceful. I take a deep breath, pick up my brush, and touch the paper with fresh, vibrant color. My life is entirely, undeniably my own. And for the first time in 66 years, that is more than enough. If you've ever navigated the painful transition of a late-life divorce, the end of a long relationship, or the courage it takes to start over when society tells you it's too late, I would love to read your story in the comments below. Sharing our truths is how we heal and find strength in these later years. And if this reflection brought a sense of comfort or clarity to your journey, please like the video and consider subscribing to join our community for the next story. Until then, take good care of yourself and never be afraid to choose honesty over comfortable illusions.